Right. It's 1:45 now, so we'll get going on to the next session. So for those of you just joining us, my name is Peter Sikanda. I'm a policy analyst with the OFA. I will be facilitating this session, Determinants of the Adoption of Environmental Best Management Practices on Farms of South Central Ontario. Before we get started, please note the following housekeeping items. As an attendee, you have joined in listen-only mode, so your microphone and webcam are turned off automatically. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the chat. You may submit questions at any time during the presentation, and we will address questions following the presentations as time allows. If there are remaining questions, we will do our best to answer those in a follow-up email. You have the option to leave and rejoin the meeting throughout the day, so feel free to attend any of the presentations that are of interest to you. A recording of the presentations will be made available on the OFA website after the event. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Michael Drescher. Michael is an associate professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo, where he teaches ecology, environmental policy, and rural development. He is also director of the Heritage Resources Center at the University of Waterloo, focusing on natural heritage systems. He holds appointments as affiliated faculty with the Ostrom Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis at Indiana University, and as associate editor to the Journal of Environmental Management. He holds a Master's of Science in Ecology from Utrecht University, Netherlands, and a PhD in Resource Conservation from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Good afternoon, Michael, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Peter. Can you hear me okay?
All good.
Excellent. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. And maybe if you could just confirm to me, I'm going to share my screen. I just hope that I will do it correctly. I don't think that I did this correctly.
Looks great.
Yes, yeah. So you just
Perfect.
see the slide deck, right?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks again, Peter, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining in for this presentation. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, co-researchers, Dr. Robert Fike of the University of Waterloo, and Dr. Wayne Caldwell, University of Guelph. I should also, of course, acknowledge the support that the universities have provided us, Waterloo and Guelph. And I'm, of course, very thankful, very grateful for the support provided by the Ontario Federation of Agriculture that organized, of course, our meeting here today, but also was of great support to this research, as well as the National Farmers Union Ontario and the Christian Farmers Federation of Ontario. And I should not forget to also mention OMAFRA, the province of Ontario, that supported this research financially. So what I want to talk today about is the adoption of environmental best management practices, focusing on just 3 of those. There's a multitude of different environmental best management practices. I'm just focusing here on 3 different ones, which is windbreaks, farm forests, and riparian buffers. And the reason why I just focus on these here is because they are I guess they align with my background. Peter has talked to my background in ecology, so I have an affinity with these kinds of vegetation elements that often contain woody vegetation that was part of my academic education. But maybe more importantly, so these things, windbreaks, farm forests, and then potentially also riparian buffers, we can we can observe from space potentially. So we can use remote sensing techniques to collect empirical information about the presence or absence those elements in the landscape. And that is already foreshadowing one of the data sources that we are using in this research. Because we want to support the data from farmers with more objectively, empirically reliable data that we can collect with remote sensing. So why should farmers be interested in adopting these environmental based management practices? So they are, depending on conditions, they are able to provide benefits for farmers as well as off the farm. So windbreaks, for example, benefit by reduced soil erosion, predominantly wind erosion. They can provide wildlife habitat. A lot of your membership, the OFA members are not only farmers, but some of them are also hunters. So the supply of wildlife habitat is important for that. Windbreaks can also lead to increases in crop yields, predominantly through the protection against damaging winds. Similarly, farm forests can provide a variety of benefits depending on conditions. They can be a protection for sources of groundwater. Again, they can provide wildlife habitat, and of course, they can also be a potential source of income from timber. Riparian buffers also can protect field from erosion. This would be more surface runoff. They can, of course, through their capture of nutrients and potential shading effects, they can lead to increased water quality by decreasing water temperature and keeping nutrients out of the water. And that then can potentially lead to more aquatic wildlife, or at least increased aquatic wildlife habitat. Now, we must also, though, acknowledge that there could be challenges with some of these environmental best management practices that I abbreviate just to EBMPs. So they, of course, require space. So that could lead to a reduction in acreage that can be farmed. There are some maintenance requirements. It's not enough to just have these elements in the landscape, but one should take care to some extent of these elements. And they are potentially also a source of pest species. We could think potentially of damaging insects, or of rodents, or some bird species that could be predating grains. So that also needs to be acknowledged. Now, just over 10 years ago, about 12 years ago, there was a study by Statistics Canada that has looked into the presence or absence of windbreaks and riparian buffers on Ontario farms. And they reported that only 28% of the farms in Ontario have windbreaks, and only 23% of them have riparian buffers. Now, while this data, I think, has to be interpreted with caution, because I find these numbers quite low, maybe a little too low. That this data indicates that the presence of these landscape elements might be lower than potentially would be beneficial. Especially if we think of the positive elements or effects of these landscape elements on farms and off farm. So these data then were reason to have a better look at the presence and absence of these EBMPs on Ontario farms, and what might be the reasons for changes in their presence. So, leading from that, we formulated a number of research questions. So the most important first one here is, what are the barriers to the adoption of environmental best management practices? So we looked at social factors, human behavior, economic barriers as well. And then how could farmers that do not already adopt these EBMPs be encouraged or helped to adopt more EBMPs on their farms? So these were the research questions. And in answering these questions, we pursued a number of objectives. So we wanted to investigate the patterns of eBMP adoption on Ontario farms. We wanted to analyze the factors that determine the adoption patterns. We wanted to understand what causal mechanisms were leading to those patterns, and then ultimately produce recommendations that could be followed to increase the adoption rates of eBMPs. And here for this presentation, I will focus predominantly on these first three objectives. Of course, the recommendations are very important, but this is work that is still in progress. So now going on to the methods of the research. So again, I want to emphasize our main partners, OFA, NFU, Ontario, and the Christian Farmers Federation. They all facilitated our research, which was absolutely critical for our success. The main vehicle of our research was a large-scale survey of Ontario farmers. So we distributed, with OFA's help, 6,000 paper surveys to OFA members, and we invited all members of OFA, NFUO, and CFFO through email invitations to online versions of the survey. We also approached the Ontario Woodlot Association, Ontario Equestrian, and some other organizations that also reached out to the membership to participate in our survey. Our survey was extensive. So we had over 100 question items in there. Not all were separate questions, but some were different elements under the same question. We will get to that a little bit later. But overall, we asked about the characteristics of the farm operator characteristics. We asked about attitudes towards eBMPs, norms and values, also in regards to environmental best management practices. And then we had a number of questions that had to do with the perception of barriers and facilitators to eBMP adoption. We also had a series of interviews that followed up on the survey. So we had 40 interviews, in-depth interviews with farmers throughout the province, in which we followed up on the results from the survey. And as I mentioned before, these eBMPs that we're looking at here are observable from space. So there is another data stream that has to do with remotely sensed data, where we can observe changes in the landscape. We have access to aerial photography of the province from 2021. And then we have other timestamps from 2016 and 2011, going back potentially to 2006. And so we can observe changes in the landscape. So the removal or growing of new eBMPs in the landscape. And that is part of the research that is still ongoing right now. In terms of analysis, the main method that we applied is a fairly advanced statistical analysis that I only briefly cover here. So it's based on a theoretical framework from social sciences that has been very widely applied in a variety of research questions. Ultimately, it comes down to the explanation of human behavior as the consequence of people's attitudes towards a thing, a potential behavior, their experience of social pressures, or sometimes also called norms and values, and their perception of barriers and facilitators to performing these behaviors. And according to this framework, these factors come together to then determine the execution of this behavior. And in our context, so we operationalize this framework in terms of attitudes as the perceived benefits from eBMPs, the norms and values through social pressures experienced by farmers to adopt eBMPs, and perceived barriers as barriers and facilitators in terms of things like available finances or labor and so on. And these then are integrated in a statistical model to allow us to estimate the incidence of EBMB adoption. The different yellow boxes here that you see in the slide, these are these different elements, the constructs in the model. We cannot directly measure those constructs, but we can ask people a question about them. So these survey questions, and then the answers to these survey questions allow us to estimate these constructs that we cannot measure, and then also measure the relationships between these constructs. So this is in broad terms how this statistical analysis works. On top of that, of course, we had the analysis of the interviews, and that is a fairly standard text analysis that I will not go further into right now. So going forward to the results. First, how did our participant pool look like? So we had 490 survey participants. This is a fairly large number. Several hundred participants is a good number that allows us to do all our statistics that we plan to do. Having said that, I would have liked to have a much larger number. As I said before, we had over 6,000 paper surveys sent out, and all farmers essentially that were membership of OFA, NFUO, and the Christian Farmers Federation were invited. So considering that, our response rate was quite low. But as I said before, this number allows us to do statistics. However, it does raise concerns about potential biases in the sample, in the participant sample relative to the general farmer population. Of those 490 surveys, we had 42% online. The rest were paper responses. 85% of the respondents were males. Farmers farmed on average over 350 acres. And owned over 250 acres, so the remainders, so about 100 acres were on average rented. On average, our participants were 63 years old and farmed since 36 years. We had participants from all across South Central Ontario, but it was not evenly distributed, as is unsurprising. So we had most participants in farmland regions 5 and 7, so in the south, in the far south of the province, and few participants in farmland region number 1, which is probably also unsurprising because of the lower numbers of farms there. Of the respondents, farmers that had livestock, most of them bred beef. Almost 2/3 of them, 40% had dairy. Poultry was present at over 20% of the farms. We had also other types of livestock, but these were the most important ones. We also had some, quotation marks, exotic forms of livestock, alpaca, pheasants, and others. But these were the most important ones. Farmers that answered that they had crops mostly grew corn at over 50%, soy also over 50%, followed by wheat at 43%. And then hay, of course, not a traditional crop, but also grown close to 40%. So overall, these data seem to be consistent with general farmer populations. But as I said before, we have a slight concern that maybe attitudinally or in other not immediately clear ways, our sample might be deviating from the general farmer population. Now coming directly to the results. So first here I present whether farmers are adopting these EBMPs, whether they are managing them actively, whether they're putting new ones, or whether they're removing them. And I would like to point out to you on the bottom top left This is a graph about the farm forests. On the right top is about windbreaks, and bottom left is riparian buffers. And at the very left was the question whether farmers were actively maintaining these EBMPs on their own land, and next to it directly whether they were maintaining these EBMPs on rented land. And very clearly, around 2/3 of farmers, depending on the specific EBMP, ranging from 47 to 72%, said that they were actively maintaining EBMPs on their own land, and a much lower proportion of farmers said that they were doing this on rented lands, between let's say around 11 to 21%. So that was interesting. Also, farmers said that they were adding EBMPs on their own land, between 20 and 35%, depending on which specific EBMP it was. And quite a bit fewer farmers said that they were seeing neighbors adding EBMPs on their land, so around 11 to 24%. Interesting also, when we were asking about whether farmers were removing EBMPs, only 4 to 12% of the farmers said that they were removing EBMPs on their own land, but they said that they have observed the neighbors removing EBMPs between 28 to 45%. So our farmers seem to be very active in maintaining EBMPs on their land. Some of them are adding EBMPs and very few are removing them, but they are observing that their neighbors might be doing so. Now, when we asked them about the benefits that they perceived of farm forests, there was a widespread belief that yes, EBMPs do provide benefits. Of course, depending on the specific EBMP, it varied. Again, on the top left are farm forests, on the right windbreaks, on the bottom left riparian buffers. And so what stood out is that there's just a perceived widespread, a wide range of different benefits. And for example, what is very often acknowledged is that it is providing wildlife habitat. Between 82 and 95% of farmers said so. Lowest agreement in these data here was about whether farm forests can be an income from non-timber. And that is maybe understandable because that might provide specific skills and knowledge about forests to enable that not every farmer might have. And there was also not that equal great agreement about the benefits from windbreaks for greater travel safety and increased crop yield. And that might be something that we might want to discuss later on. In terms of social pressures, so we asked farmers whether they thought that they should add these EBMPs, whether farmers around them do that, whether other farmers think they should, family members put pressure on them, or whether the government wants to do them, wants them to do so. And interestingly, that around 2/3 to let's say 2/3 of farmers said, yes, I should adopt these EBMPs. Interestingly, though, that when we asked them whether they felt pressure from the neighboring farmers on adopting EBMPs, very few said that they thought that farmers around them think they should adopt these EBMPs. So they feel their own conviction that they should be doing this, but they don't feel any pressure from neighbors to do so. And these other factors were in between, like family members and government. Was around 35 to 40%. In terms of barriers to adopting EBMPs, again, top left farm forests, right windbreaks, bottom is riparian buffers. Labor stood out as the most important barrier. Between 38 to 40% of farmers said that labor is restricting them. What is interesting, though, the lowest barrier, or the least often occurring barrier, is knowledge. So for the most part, farmers are convinced that they are pretty well informed about how to adopt and maintain these different EBMPs. Interesting, though, that this is less the case for riparian buffers. By and large, farmers seem to be very comfortable for windbreaks, that they know how to do this. So these were some of the results from the survey, and they are broadly supported by analysis of the in-depth interviews that we did. And I just bring a few samples of interview excerpts here. So for example, the benefits of windbreaks, one of our participants said, honestly, it's not all altruistic. It makes for better profitability on your farm because your nutrients are staying where they are. An example of the experience of social pressures. My dad always said it's the right thing to do. It's a place for the deer and stuff, you know, a corridor. And in terms of perceived barriers, in terms of labor, once you plant a windbreak, then you start then they start to get big, and then the branches are getting out in front of the combine, and then you have to start maintaining and cleaning up. So really what we find in the survey is supported by the interviews, but adds more detail and richness, of course, to our findings. What I should also add is we have had, for example, questions about the finances. Would farmers, do they think that they should be supported in EBMPs with financial subsidies? And so more than 85% of farmers said that yes, we would like subsidies, and they should be more than 50% of the cost of maintaining or adopting these. Over 35%, so over a third of farmers even wanted at least 70% of the costs offset. However, the majority of farmers, so about 2/3, said that they were not aware of any subsidy programs that would support these financial subsidies. Now, when we are taking all of this data together and put it into our statistical model, we find the following. Here, now for farm forests, when there is a red box around these numbers here, that means that there's a significant relationship. So there's a significant relationship from social pressures in determining EBMP adoption for farm forests and of perceived barriers. There is no relationship for perceived benefits. And just these factors here, benefits, social pressures, and barriers, together explain about a quarter of the adoption of farm forests on Ontario farms. And that is, I should explain a little more. We don't know in this model anything about the farmers. They could be hog farmers, there could be beef farmers, there could be chicken farmers, there could be young or old, they could have a large farm or a small farm, there could be any of those things. This is not part of the model. So without anything about the farmer and their farm operations, we can still explain a quarter of the behavior just by this model. For windbreaks, we can explain even more. So it's about 30%, so almost a third of the behavior we can explain through this model. And again, the perceived benefits of windbreaks do not play a role. NS means not significant. Again, social pressures and perceived barriers are significant. The correlation between these factors is 29% and 32%. And then when we look at the riparian buffers, it's a little different. Again, we can explain almost a third of the behavior of farmers in adoption of riparian buffers. But now the perceived benefits are becoming significant. There's a correlation of 0.18, and social pressures and perceived barriers remain significant. The most important one is no social pressures. What we also found, and these are findings that are not in the main line of our investigation, but nevertheless really interesting, is when we asked farmers whether their behavior was depending on the size and the size of the farm, and whether the owner of the land, whether that differed relatively speaking, whether they were also farmers or land developers or other owners, and we found interesting results. So, of course, many farmers do rent some land from other people that they use for agricultural production. Here what we've looked at first was whether when farmers rented land, whether the likelihood that their landlord was another farmer or a land developer, whether this depended on the distance from the nearest city. And we found, maybe not surprisingly, that the odds of the landlord of a farmer being a land developer increased by 12% for every kilometer that the farm was closer to a city. So every kilometer closer to a city, the odds of the landlord being a land developer and not a farmer increased by 12%. Now, why is that important? Because our interview results suggest that landlords that are developers, that they are encouraging their renters to clear the land. So we found here, for example, these statements. I've garnered a fair bit of income from taking out woodlots, taking out fence rows. They, the landlord, the land developers, pay me. Or that's just it, or that's it, just the maximum amount of return. The land developers don't care. They are thousands of miles away. Why would they care, or why would you care? They don't care about the conservation of fertility of the land. There's no land stewardship going on with them. Or if you're a land speculator, you buy 100 acres and you get the guys in and they clear out every stick. And if nobody stops you from clearing the bush, they clear it too. And one participant even said that they had personally experienced that the entire woodlot was cleared in a matter of days by I believe it was also a land developer owner that in that instance. So there seems to be a suggestion here in the data that land owners closer to cities have a likelihood to be land developers, and that fact leads to taking out EBMPs potentially closer to cities. Looking at the effect of farm size, we found that larger farmers have a higher likelihood to take out EBMPs. So here for the odds of a farmer removing EBMPs, for every 100 acres that the farm is increasing in size, the odds are increasing by 7% for windbreaks. Farm forest is 5%, and riparian buffers is 6%. So that means every 100 acres increase in farm size leads to an increase in the odds of taking out windbreaks, farm forests, and riparian buffers. And so for windbreaks, it's 7%, then 5%, and then 6% for farm forests and riparian buffers. So the larger the farmers, the more likely they are taking out these elements. On the other hand, with smaller farmers, we find that they are less able to have the money or to have the labor to maintain or adopt these EBMPs. So again, our interviews showed one statement here. I would say for smaller farmers, smaller properties, labor is an issue. And another statement here, last summer I contacted 2 wholesale nurseries that are local to us and nobody got back to me because my order wasn't big enough. When they are wholesaling to clients, they're putting in $100,000 orders. My $500 is not a priority. Maybe it's even kind of how people source stuff through the CAs, the conservation authorities. So taking all of this together, what did we find? So most farmers maintained their EBMPs, but they did not add new ones. Some did, but most did not. They suggest that most or a big part of their neighbors actually removed EBMPs. They agreed that EBMPs provide benefits on the farm, and of course there are also off-farm benefits, for example, water quality. Most farmers agreed that they should adopt these EBMPs, but they experienced especially labor constraints for adopting EBMPs. And they wanted subsidies of at least 50% to offset the EBMP costs. So most important for the adoption of the EBMPs for farm forests were labor barriers, for windbreaks, labor barriers and social pressures, and for riparian buffers, clearly social pressures. And very interestingly, the perceived benefits for these EBMPs were consistently of lowest importance for actually EBMP adoption. So what are the next steps for this research? well, I need to mobilize this knowledge. So I have started reaching out to farm organizations as well as the Ministry of Agriculture to try to work together with them to integrate this knowledge from this research into policy and program recommendations. I am currently in conversation with policy staff for MAFRA and writing policy briefs for their decision makers. And I'm looking forward to opportunities similarly at OFA and the other farm organizations to try to broaden understanding of these issues and think about how we can improve the situation. And thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure, and I will stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your excellent presentation. That was really great. We will now move into a question and answer part of the session. Remind attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to fire them into the chat and we will get to them as quickly as possible. Just out of curiosity, I'd like to know, where do you see the next steps for this research? Like, is there a certain area that you would really like to drill down a little deeper into and examine a little bit further?
Yeah, there are two areas. Well, actually, several areas that I find very interesting. So one has to do with the role of conservation authorities. So conservation authorities were identified as one of the main support organizations for EBMPs. Of course, also in terms of supply of knowledge, but also support of really the work, potentially supplies. However, recently, of course, we had policy changes in the province. We had Bill 23, and that forces conservation authorities on their core mandates. And while existing programs might not be directly canceled, it definitely will limit or make it impossible for conservation authorities to bring to roll out new programs. So that's a big concern. If conservation authorities are identified as one of the main supports in this field, and with this new legislation they are not anymore or not more able to do so, that's a problem, in my view. The other direction has to do with this issue of land ownership. In the province, we have a big, let me call it a problem of understanding who owns land. And I know, of course, there are personal information, there are privacy issues in there, but these data that we have so far seem to suggest that land ownership is a driving factor in how our landscapes change. And the data is stewarded by the province, but the stewardship, so land ownership data is stewarded by a province, but it is given to a crown corporation. And this crown corporation is very protective, even vis-a-vis researchers in providing access to the data. And nevertheless, that is something that I will pursue. I am really curious about finding out who owns land and how does this ownership affect what is happening on the land, especially also with increasing financialization of the Ontario farm sector. What is the role of big financial players in what we are seeing happening on the land? So these are two of the I find very interesting directions that I could see taking this research.
Yeah, it's certainly something we hear a fair amount at the OFA is land ownership is a big issue when it comes to adoption. So your results mentioned they're all from surveys and interviews, so they're self-reported. Do you have any other data that maybe are a little more objective that would support these results?
Yeah. So what I mentioned before were these remotely sensed data. Okay. So this is practically public data. Anybody in principle could download the data. So the province essentially flies. So the province of Ontario is mapped every 5 years, and that that data can be downloaded and analyzed. Now, of course, this is a huge data set. It needs to be processed before it can be analyzed. We are currently in the process to in an area about, let me say, about 50 kilometers surrounding London, to have a really detailed examination of landscape change based on remotely sensed data, comparing the data from 2021 to 2011, to really empirically see where do windbreaks disappear, where do farm forests get cut down, and can we confirm those trends that are emerging from our survey results and from the interviews? Can we actually confirm from the empirical data that this is really going on, and how does it play out spatially? If we find that around London, there might be an opportunity to scale that up and do it for the entire South Central Ontario, which would be a very huge project, but it would be amazing.
Yeah. Do you have is that comparison, is it automated somehow, or do you have a poor grad student looking at photos and comparing the
Yeah,
two?
so we have started with grad students. We captured them, then we put them in the basement and chained them to a computer. No, of course, I'm joking. No, we pay them to do this, and but it's tedious work to essentially review aerial imagery, then create polygons of farm forests and riparian buffers and so on these GIS layers, and do that at great detail and across different times. But we will not do that for very large data sets. So what we want to do is we want to train algorithms on the GIS data layers and the manually defined elements in the landscape, so that we will use the data created by our students to essentially, similar to an AI approach, we heard today so much about AI, to train an algorithm that then would scan the remainder of the data,
Right.
to make work easier for humans.
Right. We have a question from the chat around tree conservation bylaws. Were they mentioned as a barrier for farmers?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Not necessarily that I recall right now the bylaws, but it has been mentioned that sometimes there can be, let's call them ill-advised attempts in conservation policy, where if a land lies fallow for too long, and there might be some encroachment of woody vegetation, that then that might be seen as a land that should be conserved by local authorities, even though it is farmland, just that it lay fallow for a longer period of time, and farmers are concerned that in situations like that, then essentially they could not farm the land anymore. They could not take out the encroaching woody vegetation, shrubs, and so on anymore. There would be limits laid upon them to how they can use that land, and farmers are quite concerned about that. And so they would, rather than continue just farming the land, even if it's maybe not the most economically advisable thing to do, or they just continuously just plow everything under, because they don't want to get in the situation where then later the hand is tied. So they don't want to have to bury the costs of maybe sometimes a little overzealous conservation efforts. So that is indeed a potential concern. Yes, I've seen that.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for your time and presenting us to us today. I certainly see a lot of great opportunities to use this research to help us target our communications and our interventions and get a better sense of where we can put our best efforts in increasing the adoption of BMPs across the board. So thank you very much for your time. I'm going to
Thank you.
move straight into our next session. Up next, we have the